Hello and welcome. My name is TRENTONHOSHIKO, and today we are going to be doing another lighting diagram of a painting. This time, Mrs. Potter Palmer by Anders Zorn. Now, Zorn is one of my favorite painters. I really love his expressions of people, and I really like how he captures light in particular. He has some amazing drawings, he has some amazing etchings, and some of my favorite paintings. Unfortunately, my favorite painting from him is not in the public domain, so I don't have it linked here, but I am excited to talk about this painting today. As usual, if you want to find out how to use Draw.io to create cinematography lighting diagrams, you can check out the video I have linked down below that goes over the steps for importing your own image as a reference and setting up your project file. Now, I do also have an absolutely free filmmaker tool template for Draw.io that's available on my Patreon. That's linked down below as well. You can get that completely free and get access to all of these tools up here already pre-made and ready to use for your own diagramming. But with everything already imported and set up, let's get started talking about an analysis of this piece of art. Now, one of the first things I notice here is that the background behind her on the left side of the frame is very dark. Now, one of the other aspects of this is that the entire background is relatively abstracted. Now, the actual look of this painting reminds me a lot of doing a long exposure photograph where you have a flash. So you get some of that camera movement and blur to the image that's beyond depth of field blur, but the actual like details of a face or a hand or some part of the image is still frozen in its motion because of that flash. This reminds me very much of that style of look. And I think that's one thing I like about Zorn a lot, is that he kind of has this control of where the painting is more abstract and where it is more detailed and clear. And in the case of this painting, that's absolutely the case, because over her left shoulder, you can't really exactly tell what's going on. When I stare at this for a while, I kind of flip and flap back and forth between this being a wall behind her that has like a painting on it, that would be kind of this shape, or there's also another view where this is actually kind of a room that she's in, and then this is reaching out into another part of the room that's behind her extending backwards. And you can't quite tell the difference. At least I can't quite tell the difference, and I don't think that really matters. It's very interesting either way. If this was a wall that met at a corner, kind of right here as the center right there, that's definitely an interesting look. Maybe this right here is one of the chair guards. That could also be the bottom of a wall as it extends out backwards from her. But the real point that I'm trying to make is that it doesn't quite matter in this case. We do want to just have some abstract shape and form. Now, like I said, if we are planning this as an actual still photo, I think that I would do the technique I described. Shoot with a low shutter speed, maybe, a 20th of a second, and then have a flash that gave us our main freeze to the action that's happening, so that we can retain both this abstract, slightly blurry nature and also have the clarity that we need for the subject itself. Now let's move on to the more nitty-gritty lighting. We're gonna look at the shadows here. Now we have shadows on her face that are quite distinct. She has the nose being very much almost blacked out to the level of the background. It just is a little bit higher. That's probably from some of the balanced light from her dress and these lighter toned walls and floors, but it's still quite dark. Now, in the same way, on that same side, her dress right here is very dark and very much in shadow. This line right here, that's kind of a pleat of the fabric itself, is the demarcation between the light from the front and the shadow on the back. Now, the lightness of the dress having some of this bounce kind of look gives me the indication that there is some sort of wall back here. But like I said, since it's all kind of abstracted and we're not quite sure where the objects are falling in the space, we can play with that a little bit, and we can use that to lighten or darken the shadow to our taste. And very clearly, the actual light itself is coming left to right in the frame. It's not exactly straight on to her face, because otherwise we wouldn't have that level of shadow on her nose and her dress. It is coming from her right side, kind of this direction, cutting across and being blocked by the pleat of this dress. So we want to make sure that when we set up our light, that line of demarcation between the light and the shadow is being used. The tone of her dress itself, in terms of its whiteness, is quite bright. It's not overexposed though, but it is very bright, and it kind of draws imagery of being angelic almost in terms of the level of brightness. And I would say that just in terms of costuming, style, design, all these kinds of things, the edge of her shawl right here also helps conjure that image of being angelic in its own right. Now, I don't know much about Miss Palmer, but she was, from my little bit of research, both very wealthy and also considered a philanthropist. Her husband helped rebuild Chicago after the Great Fire. I'm not sure if any of that would qualify her to be particularly angelic, but I do think that it's interesting that you can see those types of things coming out in this painting and the style that Zorn is using. Now, that could also be in contrast. It could be how she sees herself. There's very different ways that we can read this, but I think it's interesting, and I think it's something that we want to reflect in terms of how we design the light. So with that, let's get started actually doing the light. Now, this is relatively simple. We have one really strong light, basically, coming from left to right. But let's not get ahead of ourselves. I'm going to first set up a room. For the sake of some fun, I'm going to kind of go halfway between the ideas that I have for what this is back here. I'm going to say that this isn't a wall that's directly behind her, but it is a little further back, enough to create a little bit more depth, and we can have some light back there, while also not being a fully extended space. So I'm kind of cheating in terms of how we are actually defining this, but I don't think it really matters for how we're going to get the look of this image in terms of that really strong, hard light. And we're going to place her right about there. That way we can kind of have this dark edge back to her side, and also at the same time have some of this detail back here as if it was around a little bit of a corner. And our camera is coming at a like 45-degree angle to her. It might be just a little more shallow to get a little bit more of her front, but somewhere along those lines. Now, I would say that this is more on the wide to normal side of things, not excessively wide, but a wide to normal side of the lens, because there isn't that much compression between these background spaces. And I think that's part of the abstraction that's happening, but also we aren't getting a huge amount of distortion on her, either in terms of flattening her out or having more of like a bulbous center to the image. Now, once again, as always with these are paintings that are done with at least mostly human eye. You can have camera lucida or camera obscura type things also, but in this case, I'm going with a mostly human view, maybe a normal lens at around 50 millimeters. And so I think that what the best way to get this would be is to use a really hard light source. Now, like we said, we want to have this source be coming from the left side of the frame, but her right side, like very clearly her right side, so that we get this hard line down the side of her dress. Now, what's interesting is just in terms of composition, this hard line is actually almost centered, and it is very interesting to me to have something that is so clearly a line in that vertical center. That's something that can be considered more difficult to do and have it look natural still in terms of composition, and I think Zorn does it very well here. She herself is centered in the frame. This is very much a classic cross or T pose in terms of actually framing a portrait. Now, when we're talking hard light here, the simplest and cheapest way would be to use a Bowens mount compatible lamp that has a hood, just a simple reflector hood that will get you hard light that's coming across, and that will make it harder than just, an open face light. It'll make it harder than just an LED panel, and it'll certainly make it harder than something that is diffused. But the hood in particular comes with lots of different types of lights and is a cheap, effective way to get hard light. Now, you will run into problems with multiple shadows, but for an image like this, because it's more abstract, because there are so many different folds and pleats, I don't know how much that would affect the quality of your image for this kind of style. It might actually work just fine or even well. You can also use slight diffusion with Bowen's hoods, and that helps cut down on the multi-shadow effect. But if you want to make sure that you have this really nice hard light coming across, you're going to want to be able to use a Fresnel so that you can really dial in that shadow's hardness with the spot and flood features. We know we want hard light, but being able to control that, just having a little bit more minute detail in terms of how those edges are being presented, because you can change how that lens is affecting the light, is useful, and it helps focus that light so that the light that's on the subject is a bit brighter, and I think that that serves this look overall. It's almost like she is caught in the spotlight. And in terms of being a publicly known person, being caught in the spotlight is thematically appropriate for this type of portrait. So we're going to have a Fresnel on here, and we're going to be able to adjust that spot to flood to control how this shadow is looking on her nose, and also how the shadow is being defined by the pleat of the dress. Now, one thing to note is that it is crossing over onto the other side of her face. We are distinctly getting light, and it's not just that little tiny Rembrandt triangle. It is coming all the way across. So while it is at an angle, you might have to play around with it just a little bit, and especially with how the actor or actress is positioned, but you want it to make it onto both sides and have that shadow be much more on the cheek rather than on the front of the face. We want the full face exposed, we want the full front of her body exposed, but we don't want the side to be getting all that much. So to show that, let's get a light path. And so we can see how that would work. If this was a three-dimensional face, it would be hitting her on her right side and just a little bit on the left side. The nose from this angle would be created into that shadow there. Now we can tell that this is not further over, something kind of like this, because the nose shadow isn't going to the right side of the frame, at least significantly. There's probably just a little bit of an edge there, but for all intents and purposes, it's not creating a shadow because the light's perpendicular. The nose is not creating a shadow because it's being hit by the light, it's creating a shadow because it has the absence of light. And while that sounds like the same thing, there is a slight difference between those two things. Now, I do just want to point out that in terms of this composition, I really like to look for light, dark patterns in images. It's a really good way to make sure you have enough contrast. And here we have the dark side of her face on her left side, then the left lighter side. The nose is dark in the middle, and then on her right side of the face, which is the left side of the frame, is once again light before we go into falling off into the blackness of the background behind her. And so we get this very clear light, dark pattern all the way across. We get the proper contrast to be able to make out her face very easily in this image. And the same thing can be said for whatever background right here being light, the shadow of her dress being dark, the front of her dress being light, the floor in front of her being dark. And there's even smaller bits within those larger sections where we have this shadow right here that's breaking up the lightness of this, or this streak of light that's in the middle of the shadow. And these are all things to be thinking about and considering when designing your images, either still or motion. Now, if this is in motion, that dress is going to be moving, but by having the light in the position that we have it, when it moves, it's going to catch the light or block the light in that alternating pattern as she moves with it. Maybe this is her greeting guests at a social event, and she's turning her body to say, hello, welcome to my home. And as she turns, that dress furls and it waves with her motion, swaying with her body. And that sway, like I said, catches the light and expresses it slightly differently because that fabric has that organic movement in of itself. And so this is our key light setup, and this is the most important part of this image, because really clearly that is the focus. The rest of the light we're going to talk about is much more general and could be taken or left depending exactly on the look you're going for. But this is the main idea. And I want to be clear that there is basically no light back here relative to the rest of the image. And that is why I've so clearly had this just point directly this way without any light really ending up on this side. But you might notice that ever so slightly, there is a tiny, tiny hair light, just a little bit of edge contrast right there that helps make sure her hair doesn't disappear in the background. And once again, that's still an expression of that light, dark, light, dark. We have the dark background, we have the light of that slight hair light, we have the dark of her hair, and then we have the light of the front of her head. So we want to make sure that we do have some light coming from back here that will bounce back on her. And so to do that, instead of doing anything fancy with having another light, I'm going to use a bounce cart. It'll be right outside the frame, just behind her, and it will push the light back towards her. It doesn't need to be anything very powerful. We just need something to create that little edge of contrast. Now, I could do this with a light, yes, but I'm preferring to do it with a bounce because I want it to be very subtle and I don't want that light to reach all the way back into this dark right here. I don't want to use a lantern or something like that like I would usually do because I want this to be just so delicately subtle. Now, if you were going to use a lamp for this so that you just have a little bit more direct control of dialing it in because your lamp has a dimmer switch, well, I would say make sure to use barn doors or flags to keep it off of the back wall here and only on her back. But this is a very cheap way to do it, and that's my focus usually. How do we do this the most cost effectively for the look that we're going for? And something that's definitely interesting about this image is that there is a little bit of what I would say artistic impression and interpretation of the light, because the floor right in front of Miss Palmer isn't all that bright despite her dress being bright. But the floor behind her in this space is brighter for sure. And so there is like this kind of tonal difference between right here and right here that isn't necessarily congruent with the tone of her dress. And that's to make sure that our eye is drawn to her and not, some random spot on the floor. And so I will say that this light right here behind her that we can see past the train of her dress is able to be seen as part of the light that is passing behind her on the left side. Now, like I said, this could be a painting, this could be another room, this could be even a window because it has this kind of bluish tint and some of these brighter tones. This back here is very abstract. So what I'm going to talk about here is how to get some brightness back here. But depending on exactly what you would have back here will change it. If this was a window, maybe that's actually the motivation for that little bit of hair light. If this is just another room with a light in it, same thing, could be having just a little bit of that hair light from light that is coming from that space. Because we don't quite know what it is, I'm going to say let's keep it more abstract and vague and just have a light that is lighting it and have it be that our goal is to have a light back there without it being anything too noticeable or too detailed for the rest of the scene. So I would say that you could easily take a light panel and push it this direction. And in doing so, you probably would need to have a flag because you don't want that light reaching onto her. So we have a light right here that's casting back into this space, and we're going to be casting it relatively widely. So whatever details as a painting on the wall, or I keep looking at this and it might be a chair here. Like I said, it's much more abstract than detailed in some sort of perfect way because this is not the focus. And you shouldn't be worried about this in terms of the detail rendering, but rather having that bright, dark, bright, dark look. That's more of our focus here. And so I've put this light panel here. This could be just about anything. It could be a softbox. It could be an octabox. I wouldn't say it'd be a lantern. You'd want some directionality with it. And if you're using a softbox, you might not need the flag, but it depends on exactly what you're going for and exactly the budget you have. The softbox would control the spill more so than just maybe a panel by itself. If you have another Bowen's mount lamp head, you could maybe use a hood and some barn doors to cut that light. But the important thing is right about here, about 2/3 of the way through the image, we want that light to fall off over to the left. If we look at how the camera right here would be seeing this image, it would be, vaguely light, dark, light on her face, dark on the left. And that to me is the idea behind how you can light this image. This is a relatively simple setup. We have one lamp with one Fresnel. This could even still be a hood with barn doors. We have a softbox. We maybe have a flag, and we have a bounce. This is a couple $100s of equipment that can be used over and over again. These are basic pieces of lighting equipment, and we can get something that looks like this. Now, if you were doing this as a still photo, I definitely would say that this lamp right here could be a flash, and we could do that slow shutter speed with the flash to freeze the motion. I think that would look really, really cool. But having the detail of the hair light, making sure that we're getting that light, dark pattern, that is the focus here for me. That is the design. That's taking something that's a relatively simple setup and a relatively small amount of gear and making an image that pops and that expresses about this person and captures them really, really well. And I guess I will say that with this line right here and how bright back here is, I could see how this could be another room with a window that's coming this way, but this is really open to interpretation. I don't want to focus too much on the background at all here, because what we're talking about really is the light that's falling on her, and that is coming from our key with the Fresnel. Lighting portraits like this is so fun because you're using minute details of how lights actually work and how they create shadows or don't create shadows or are diffused or can be bounced, and how they reflect in the space itself and how they reflect in people's eyes. And you're using all of those different individual factors to capture somebody's likeness in a way that says something about them. And even within that, you have multiple ways of interpreting things. These are ideas of art that reach beyond the technical, yes, we're going to put our Fresnel here and we are going to turn it to 80%. Yes, that's important, but by understanding these different factors and talking about them and discussing them, we are learning ways to actually create the story in individual frames and individual setups within our overarching short or feature film. And it doesn't matter what your budget is, because something like this could be done technically with just, household lamps. You're going to have to get a little bit more creative, and you're going to have to get the lamps a lot closer, and it's not going to look exactly the same, but you can develop looks from basically any light source that help tell your story for your project. And so that's what I'm going to leave you with today. I hope that this video might have helped you just learn a little bit more about how you can light portraits like this one. I really think this is a gorgeous painting, and I just love the ambiguity of the background and the flowing nature of her dress. I just think it's so well done, and just to reiterate, Anders Zorn is definitely one of my favorite painters. If you want to get the filmmaker template tools that I have up here that I've been using, you can find that at my Patreon, patreon.com/TRENTONHOSHIKO. There's a link down in the description. You can also sign up there for more and to support my videos, including these lighting diagrams. The tiers start at just $2 a month. If you're curious about getting any of the tools for yourself that we've discussed in this video, I have affiliate links down in the video's description. If you are going to purchase any of the GVM LED lamps or lights, I have a special 10% off discount code also down in the video's description. And you can subscribe for more videos like this one, and also general videos about cinematography, lighting, and micro budget filmmaking. And we're going to be talking about a whole lot of really great stuff coming up. I have a couple really cool lighting demonstration videos that are going to be coming out in the next few weeks. Thank you so much for watching. I really appreciate it. It means the world to me to be able to talk about art and cinematography in these ways. I hope you have a wonderful week. Stay safe out there.